and being an adult wasn't fun, and losing sleep wasn't fun, and not knowing who was going to buy nappies or pay for food was also not fun. My first day, I was assigned as personal officer to Myra Hindley. The second one said to me, and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You know, Claire, if you lose your integrity, you can never take it to bed again."
Hello grown-ups, and welcome to this week's episode of A Beginner's Guide to Being a Grown-Up with me, your host, Sam Cooper-Gray. This week we're interviewing Claire Parkinson. So Claire's had a really interesting journey through to adulthood, starting with getting pregnant at 16 but then eventually becoming the governor of London prisons and then throwing everything up in the air and moving to the other side of the planet. So please join me in welcoming her to the podcast. Claire, welcome. And I'm going to kick off with our first big question, which is, tell me a little bit about your journey into adulthood.
Okay, so I was raised in the 70s in the Margaret Thatcher era. Working class family, lived in what we call social housing, I guess, council housing, an estate of about 1,000 houses built by London Borough Council as part of London Overspill in the East End of England. Great childhood. I didn't really aspire to be a leader. I used to see on the black and white TV the way Margaret Thatcher was bullied and ridiculed and everything awful. For the most powerful woman in the world at the time, I thought, I don't want to be a woman in leadership at all. So I was quite happy being a child and having no real ambitions. Then, probably unsurprisingly, when you consider how I was behaving at the time, at 16, I found out I was pregnant, and with my now son, and wasn't obviously planned, but I think it's fair to say it wasn't unplanned, and these things do happen. There's a certain biology behind it. And Mum and Dad were least pleased, and I left home. So I think that was probably the first time I thought I was an adult, although in hindsight I was sorely mistaken. Very dark period in my life, it's fair to say. Then my son came along, and it wasn't as easy as I had anticipated, and being an adult wasn't fun, and losing sleep wasn't fun, and not knowing who was going to buy nappies or pay for food was also not fun. So I decided in my head right there and then that I wanted to go back and be a child and go back and live with my parents. So at 19, I went back to live with my parents, and poor parents, all their dreams of, working part-time and slowing life down and retiring at 55 were probably blown out of the water by this teenage child who came home with a toddler who at the time was nearly 2. Then I was given a council house because obviously I didn't have a home, not really, and I had a child. So after walking the streets of the town I lived in for many days and many hours, writing the list of all the houses that were empty, I used to look in the window, and then I'd go in the council offices and say, can I have this one? Can I have this one? Eventually, I think they gave up and said, yes, you can have that one. And I moved in. Of course, I still wasn't quite an adult, although, I again thought I was at the ripe old age. At the time, would have been about 21. And Mum and Dad got kind of fed up with me. It was a little bit selfish, sex, drugs, rock and roll, chaos, living my childhood with adult responsibilities. The two don't often go well together. And Mum and Dad had got tired of it after a while, although we weren't living together. And Mum had said, for goodness sake, it's time to grow up, Claire, and get a real job. And then this serendipitous moment occurred, and a newspaper boy put a Daily Mail through my letterbox in error. And I heard the letterbox go, And I went and picked it up, and I was like, there's a job section. So I lay on the floor, went through the sections, found the jobs, and there was 2 jobs that I thought I could do. One was an air hostess for Virgin Atlantic, and the other one was a prison officer role. And I applied for both jobs, and I assumed at that point it would make me a grown-up.
Wow. So 2 quite different jobs to think you were skilled to do, which I love. So I think we might come back to that, because I think, I mean, although they both involve people, I think probably quite the extreme. But also the fact that at 20 you were kind of finding property that was empty and challenging the council probably tells us a little bit about your tenacity, even though you're saying you weren't quite a grown up yet. So I know which route you went down, but our listeners don't. So tell us what happened next. You applied to both Virgin and to the prison service, and what happened next?
So as I was still a bit of a child, that year, while I was waiting for responses from both, I decided I was going to go abroad and be a holiday representative, so like a travel guide, which was fantastic. And while I was away, I was offered both jobs. Now, the Virgin Atlantic offered me the European legs flight. I think it was Turkey and Greece, which definitely appealed to my ego. Those were the days where they could tell you what your minimum height had to be, what your maximum height had to be, and what you had to weigh. I mean, I don't think they do that now, but they certainly did in those days. So I was, my ego liked the fact that I was accepted. I wouldn't now be, to be honest. But then I would have been if those rules still applied today. And the prison officer job, I didn't know anybody in that job. I didn't really know anything about it, but it paid £1,000 a year more. So it was £14,328 starting. And they also offered to pay for childcare for my son.
Wow.
At the time, which was the first time they'd ever done it, so that I could go away and train. So it was a no-brainer for me. All of the obstacles that I'd always put up in my head before was always because I was a single parent and who was going to look after my son. They took that away and said, we'll pay for someone to care for him. He can have proper care. So I opted to take the prison officer job.
Wow, and that's quite... back then, that must have been incredibly rare for anyone. A company, obviously the prison service is state-led, to actually have that presence of mind to offer you that extra support, because that's not common, is it?
No, as far as I understand, I was the first person that they'd ever done that for. We had a lady who was big into diversity and inclusion, which of course in those days wasn't called that. I think it was just the equal opportunities representative. And she said, you know what, we're going to make this happen. And they did. It was quite extraordinary. But of course, I did get kicked out of college. I will say that, because I was a bit of a clown. But they did send me back to a different college because they thought I was worth the investment. Whew.
And again, I think that says something about they clearly saw something in you that gave them the desire to support you. So there was clearly something there from an early age. So tell us a little bit about your experience in the prison service, because, as a woman, and just as anyone, it looks like a really hard job. So tell me a bit about that.
Well, I was 26 when I first stepped foot in a real prison. And my first day, I was assigned as personal officer to Myra Hindley, which everyone in the UK who's listening to this would know who Myra Hindley is. Over here, not so much. But yeah, so I was assigned to be her personal officer. And although, I wasn't very worldly at 26 in terms of, current affairs, I certainly knew Myra Hindley. And I certainly knew about her crimes, as you know, the whole of the UK did if you were born in the 70s or before. So I was a bit kind of freaked out. But at the same time, curious, intrigued. I wanted to learn, I wanted to observe her. I wanted to just see what a mass killer looks like, because I've never seen one like in real life, as most of us haven't. And I was just blown away by how unremarkable she was, how normal she was, how frail she was. And that was the first time I realised that, criminals walk among us, and there is no one shoe fits all. You can't look and say, oh yeah, you're a criminal. That was the first time I'd experienced that, because, the media and the telly do depict certain crime demographics with certain cultures and yada, 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 yada. It's the first time I'd experienced just somebody that was like my grandma, looking, sounding so normal, aside from her horrific crimes.
Yeah.
So that was another one of those kind of like emotionally growing up moments.
Yeah. So you obviously worked your way up through the prison service and then moved to Australia. So tell us about that journey and kind of what you ended up doing when you emigrated, because it's very different from the prison service. Although you might tell me it's not that different. So tell me a bit about that.
Okay, so prison service at the time required you to wait, I think it was 4 years before you were able to sit the senior officer's exam. So that was the minimum. So I had to wait 4 years, which, as you probably have already gathered, patience was not one of my strong suits. So in the 4 years I was unable to sit the exam because my tenure wasn't there. I volunteered for just about every single course and training event known to humankind and became a hostage negotiator, which was definitely the best thing I ever learned, because I still use those skills in the boardroom today. Not for hostages, obviously, but it's pretty good to have the negotiating and influencing skills, although there's been a couple of times, I have to say. But we won't talk about those in too much detail. And then I sat the senior officer's exam and passed it. And then when you pass that, you have to pass like a job simulation test, which I passed that too. So I became a senior officer. And then quickly after that, I was able to apply for promotion to be a principal officer. And because I'd already waited 4 years, there's no way I was going to sit tight on that one. I wanted to be a principal officer, so I became a principal officer. And then I was able to sit the governor's exam and the governor's job simulation assessment centres, and I became a prison governor, which was pretty cool. So I moved around the UK quite a lot. It was pretty standard in those days that if you got promotion, you moved. Prison service would generally move your home and your family. So I moved around with every single promotion. So I covered the UK quite a lot and ended up as looking after all of London's prisons operations and probation operations. So pretty cool. Counter-terrorism, staff corruption and 10 prisons, which, I pat myself on the back for. I felt like I was a grown-up once again. And then clearly I'm bloody old, right? But then there was an email drop in my inbox one day through LinkedIn, out the blue, from a person claiming to be in Australia saying, would you consider coming to Australia and running a prison over here? So, of course, I thought it was a hoax. I researched them, realised they were bona fide and replied with, yes, I'd love to. And pretty much within 7 weeks from that email, I'd had an interview. I'd gone to Singapore for the second interview. I'd been offered the job. I'd signed my contract. I'd sold my house. I'd quit my job. My partner had quitted his job. And we were living with my father-in-law, waiting for our visas to come through, to come over to Australia. And Christmas Eve, I reckon it would have been about 2 o'clock in the morning, Christmas Eve. Got an email, and the immigration agent who'd been managing our case In the subject line header, it said, drum roll, it gives me great pleasure in granting you your permanent resident. We'd become quite bonded because, I was push. Anyway, which is probably unsurprising. And then I got my visa, and we all came over to Australia on New Year's Eve that same year, 2011, which was pretty cool. As when you migrate to a new country as a state-sponsored migrant, the visa that I was on at the time required that we stay in the role working for government for a period of 2 years. It's fair to say that, I'd gone to quite a small prison compared to, all of London's prisons. So I'd gone from, 10,000 staff down to maybe 170. So, it was a slower pace, but it was perfect to understand a new culture because it's a completely different culture, Aussie prisons. And then another serendipitous moment came when I was looking through the local newspaper and saw that there was a mining company that had relocated itself from Melbourne to Adelaide. And the CEO, they did a big profile of the CEO, and he said in there, we're a mining company that creates value for our stakeholders, which kind of made me want to read some more. And then he went on to say, quite maturely, actually, certainly from what I thought I knew about mining companies, he said, our stakeholders are not just investors, they're community, their government, as our staff, our suppliers, our contractors, everybody. And I was like, he sounds like a public servant, My job as a public servant was to serve the public. And here he is running a big mining company talking about serving stakeholders and not just investors. I was like, I need to meet this dude. So I messaged him through LinkedIn and pretty much said, it was a Friday night, I probably had a glass of wine or two. I said, I think you need to meet me. And he replied with LOL. And I was like, what does that mean? Anyway, long story short, we met and I asked him for a job. And he said, I can't just give you a job, Claire. And I'm like, why? And he said, well, because, we're a lean organisation and we're scaling down. We're merging two offices together, like we're cutting our corporate overheads. And I was like, okay, will you be my mentor then? And poor bugger had no choice but to say yes, because I was standing between him and the door. So I knew I'd get to see him again. Yeah.
So there's clearly a tenacity to you, Claire. And I love that. I mean, the fact that, you wanted to carry on having discussions with this guy and you basically gave him no choice but to mentor you, I love. How did you get from that initial conversation to writing your book?
So I'd already thought about writing the book at that point. There've been many times in my life where I thought, there's a book in me. I think everybody's probably got a book in them. But when I went to the prison in Australia, it was so funny. And I think prisons can be quite funny anyway, but it was funny from a nature perspective. And I've never had fun in a prison from a nature perspective. We'd have kangaroos bouncing into the fence trying to break in the prison. We'd have brown snakes. We'd have pumpkins growing on the perimeter. We'd have wild melons. I got attacked by a swarm of bees. I mean, and it was red dust everywhere. So I thought it was the outback. Apparently it's regional South Australia, but to us British people, it was the outback. So I had this collateral, if you like, going round in my head of these quite extraordinary scenarios that I just wanted to get on paper. And I started, writing things down. And every time, sometimes I'd be driving and I'd remember something that happened that was funny when I was younger. And I just made a little note of it. And some of them are quite ridiculous stories. I mean, I was, really quite a plonker when I was younger. But in hindsight, I look back and I would have made me laugh, So I was kind of like reliving the chaos, which at the time as a younger person wasn't funny, or at the time when I was running the prison, it wasn't funny. But when I think about it from a place of safety or a place of, you know, capacity to think things through, it's actually quite hilarious. So I started keeping a record, and I decided that at one point in my life, I was going to honour my younger self, who was, you know, quite fractured and broken from a teenage perspective, and write my book. And initially I was going to write it just so that my grandkids knew where they got that quirky streak from. If at some point in their life they go, where do we get that from? There, that's where we get it from. This crazy one here who was a bit of a live wire. So yeah, I started thinking about it probably from the South Australian prison experience and migration and all of the trauma and joy that brings. And because I was working for a company that truly celebrated difference, I was able to start coming out of myself and being my true self. And that helped the creativity side of it, I guess. And that was the start of the 8-year journey, putting pen to paper and documenting shitty grit.
Which is a brilliant title, by the way. I absolutely love it. And for listeners, we will put a link to the book in the show notes. So you say working for a company kind of enabled you to be yourself. Is that when you moved into mining?
Yes.
Because most people maybe wouldn't think of mining as being that place. So tell us a bit more about how that move kind of made you feel like you could kind of really, truly be yourself.
Oh, I think... when you're a prison governor, you know, there's some pomp and ceremony that comes with that. You can be, you know, I can be a bit of a clown. I can also be pretty tough, which you could imagine you probably need an abundance of toughness in the role as a prison governor, particularly as a female, and particularly in those days. And a migrant, you know, and the first female in the prison I run here in South Australia. And there was always a kind of cap on how much I brought myself to that role, because, you know, you couldn't expose your personal life in an environment like prison. It is still quite a dangerous environment. So you didn't bring your whole self to work because to some degree it wasn't safe to do so, as well as the professional etiquette around it in the role I was in. When I went into mining, I was obviously no longer in a criminal outfit. So I was surrounded by equals, if you like. And I was a leader I was on the executive, which was quite extraordinary for someone of my background to go into a mining executive. And to some degree, being able to talk to humans and have a laugh and empathise, as well as lead, as well as manage, requires you to bring your best self. And particularly male-dominated frontline workforce, away from home, you could say lost their liberty, you know, 2 weeks at a time in the outback, you know, limited contact to loved ones. It heightens the level of stresses on the humans that are away from their kids, their wives, their husbands, their partners, their loved ones. And I fit into that role pretty well, which my prison background, as well as probably my upbringing, I think enabled me to bring those skills to the fore. Yeah,
absolutely. And also, I suppose, because, you know, both the prison and mining is a very male-dominated environment, and a separation. I'd never really thought about that before, that actually the similarities, one out of choice, to be fair, one not out of choice, but the separation from people and what you know and what is familiar is actually quite consistent, as is it being in the outback for that, well, almost in the outback for the prison that you ran. So if we go back to your younger self, your 18-year-old self with a young son on her own, struggles you know, communicating with your parents, have moved out. What would she recognise in you today?
Well, she certainly wouldn't recognise the ability to laugh at oneself and the comfort in uncomfortableness. She would be like, well, I don't know. What would she recognise in me now? Probably my persistence. And actually, I don't want to say bravery because that sounds a bit wanky. Am I allowed to say that? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, I could say wonky. I think, I don't know, there wasn't much growing up, and arguably now, that I'm afraid to do. And I'm not talking adrenaline stuff, because I hate jumping out of planes. I'll do it, but I hate it. And I throw up on myself, so it's never good for anyone watching. But I've always been okay just knocking on doors of things that most people probably wouldn't. I'm not afraid of rejection at all. I'd rather die trying than not try. So I think she'd recognise, geez, is she ever going to stop doing that stuff? Like, come on. Like, because, you know, it is exhausting.
Yeah.
It is exhausting.
I think it's clearly just something in you, though, that you wouldn't be you if you weren't doing that kind of knocking down barriers and knocking on doors. So if we stay with your 18-year-old self, what would she be absolutely blown away by?
That I wrote the book and published it. She'd be like, have you said that stuff out loud? Like, you know, like, what? Yeah, no, I think she'd be shocked. And, you know, and I remember I was talking to the publisher, and she was talking me through the things I had to have as well as a manuscript. You know, you have to have a contents page and you have an acknowledgement page. And then she said, you have a dedication page. And I was like, dedication? She said, yeah. I said, but isn't that acknowledgement? She said, no. I was like, okay. So, and that actually was harder than a lot of the content in the book, because I had to decide, who was I going to dedicate the book to? So the acknowledgement, you know, I acknowledge my children, I acknowledge my parents, the people I've worked with, the people that have pushed me along, and, you know, yada, yada, yada. But the dedication page was, what specific moment is worthy of dedication? And it took me a good week. I nearly missed the cut-off point for print, and I decided to dedicate the book to myself. And I dedicated it to little Claire, because, and I'm trying to think what I exactly said, but I said, I dedicate the book for little Claire. You can come out now. You no longer need to hide. Something along those lines, you know? And I was like, yeah. So I think she'd be like, she'd read that and she'd go, wow, we are going to get there. Might take half a century, but we'll get there. Yeah. So I dedicated it to me, and yeah, that was quite confronting.
I think that's incredibly powerful, and I want to say it's brave, but I'm not sure if brave's the right word, but it feels quite brave to dedicate it to yourself. But I mean that as the biggest compliment in the world, because actually very few of us have that self-reflection to go back and look at our younger self and go, actually, you know, she deserves to be recognised as well. And, you know, you think what you've been through since little Claire, and the life that you've led is amazing. So I'm going to move you on to talk a little bit about the decisions we make. And obviously you've made some big decisions, one of which picking up your life, your partner and your son, and moving to the other side of the planet. which in 7 weeks, which is amazing. I remember getting offered a job in Australia relatively early in my career, and the guy who offered me a job said to me, he said, "What would your husband think?" And I said, "I don't know. Shall I message him?" And I think our partners are really important in this. And I messaged my husband and said, "I've been offered a job in Sydney." And about 30 seconds later, it pinged back, and I was still in the interview. And this guy said, "Well, what did he say?" And I was like, "Have packed. Which airport are we leaving from?" So I do think the people we put around us very much help us on that journey as well. But tell me about the best decision you've ever made.
Moving to Australia. Yeah, that was a big one. Not just for me and my partner, but for my daughter. It was huge. It was around the times. Do you remember when we had the 2011? We had the just mindless rioting across the UK. I can't even remember what the start of it was. Maybe a police incident somewhere in the UK. It might have even been America. And there was just this mindless rioting as a result of that. And I remember overnight in prison, because obviously I was working in a prison at the time, and the UK had like literally thousands of people come into custody. So these are not like, you put a stone through the window. These are really nasty crimes as part of the riots. And I remember going home thinking, well, we've had like 3,000 more people, maybe more, put in prison literally in a week than we've ever had before. And I looked at my 4-year-old daughter and thought, I think it's time to leave. And I'm really proud to be British. But at that time, it wasn't good watching it all play out, and particularly in the work environment I was in, I was quite ashamed. So we left, and hard 2 years followed. I grieved my home country, never realised I was patriotic before. Even the sausages over here weren't like they were in England, everything. I was like, I literally was resisting the change. And that was really hard. But it was the best decision I ever made.
I'm going to put an extra question in just because I really want to know, and partly because I've got some family in Australia and I've got family all over the world, and it just fascinates me. So I'm going to ask a question. You've been out there, 14, 15 years now. Tell me, what is the thing that you still miss? What's like the biggest thing you still miss about the UK? Is it still the sausages?
Oh, pork and apple sausages from Tesco Finest are a big one. And a chicken Danzak tikka balti from the Dil Raj in Abingdon is a big one. Marks and Spencer's prawn mayonnaise sandwiches. Greg's sausage roll. Are they still 99 pence?
I'm not sure, but they'll be pretty close.
Greg's sausage roll. And of course, my family.
I mean, obviously, at the end of that list of fabulous food, yes, I love it. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Okay. So that was just a little extra one because I was just desperate to know the answer. So you talked about getting that executive in the mining company as a mentor, and you've touched on the fact that people have kind of helped and pushed you through your career as you've gone through. And I'm sure you've done the same for others. And so during that time, you'll have been given and taken and offered a lot of advice. What's the best piece of advice you've been given that you then completely ignored?
Don't drink yellow snow. I couldn't resist that, I'm sorry. Okay, best bit of advice I've ever been given that I completely ignored. It's a bit of a double-ended sword here. So I had 2 pieces of advice around the same scenario from very senior people at the time in government. And one had told me to ignore something I'd seen that was really unprofessional, misconduct, arguably. And another one had said to me, and they were both great pieces of advice, but the second one said to me, and he looked me in the eye and he said, you know, Claire, if you lose your integrity, you can never take it to bed again. And one competed with the other. The one person that had said it as a female had said to me, ignore, keep moving on, pretend it didn't happen, we're all friends here. And the other one, who was a man, had said, well, he didn't give me any advice other than to say, if you lose your integrity, you can never go to bed with it again. So I ignored the one that said, let it go. And I still go to bed with my integrity today.
And I think that observation advice from the on the integrity pieces, that's really fundamental, quite deep advice actually for everything, isn't it, as opposed to just for an individual situation, and phrased so beautifully as well. So one of the things we ask all of our guests is to set a personal challenge to our listeners. So if you could set a personal challenge to all of our listeners, what's the one thing you would set them as a challenge?
Dig deep to identify what your dream was as a younger self. When you know what it is, honour it. Honour it. If it means your New Year's resolution is that, if it means honouring it is tomorrow, whatever it is, just honour your younger self. Because they banked on you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, honour those younger dreams. I think we do all have dreams when we're younger and they get put aside because, real life takes over. But It is that kind of coming back to that thing. Amazing. Love it. And I don't know how we've got here. We're at the end of the podcast. And Claire, I've enjoyed listening to your story so much. I'm really looking forward to reading Shitty Grit, your book. So we're at that last piece. So I think there's a book in me as well, and it's called A Beginner's Guide to Being a Grown-Up. So in that book, what piece of advice would you give me to put in the Beginner's Guide to Being a Grown-Up?
Nobody knows what they want to be when they're a grown-up, and that's okay.
Fantastic. Absolutely. They probably know more what they want to be when they're younger, right?
Totally.
And we lose
no
it.
Boundaries, and we have nothing that can get in our way. Our imagination is unbroken by life and tarnished by what the world tells us it should be.
Yeah. Brilliant. Claire, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I've loved learning more about your story, and I know the listeners will have really learned something today.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode. It's the 40th episode and the end of series 3. And we've loved taking you on this journey with us. We will be back in the new year with the new series and with more fabulous people to listen and learn from. So please do like, follow and subscribe wherever you are so you don't miss the new launch of the new series. And in the meantime, enjoy being a grown-up.